Welcome back. Ignite Day 2 in the Gold Coast. I'm Andrew Coates here with Greg Lowe. You've just been watching Adam Kogan, of course, who's watching you in Visual Studio 2017. But Greg, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you. Great to be along.
You're a regular in our events here in Australia.
Indeed.
And all around the world.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about yourself. You're a regional director and a Microsoft MVP.
Yeah, I worked in the data platform for a long time. They call us data platform nowadays. It was SQL Server MVPs. I started working with SQL Server about 1992, so it sort of feels like forever at this stage. And so probably long enough to be well involved with the product group and things, and been to a good number of events around, and of course this has always been one of the favourites because it's local.
It is local, that's right. I mean, you're a Queensland boy from way back.
Originally Queensland.
Based in Melbourne now.
Yes. Bucked the trend. Most people move from Melbourne to Queensland, but yeah, so did the other way around.
You've been doing lots of community things. So you run SQL Down Under. Tell us a bit about that.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, one of the things I decided years ago we needed podcasts, but I wanted to do ones that had sort of fairly in-depth interviews, and so there are a lot of things with fairly shallow content that were sort of quite short. But I was determined that I want to give people an opportunity to get to know some of the more influential people in the community or the product group, authors of books they might have read, and so on. And so we tend to do a format where it's about an hour or so, each of the podcasts, and drill fairly heavily into the area that the person's doing. And so, yeah, typically at the moment, I suppose not gigantic, but we get probably 40, 50,000 downloads for each episode, which is great.
That's pretty impressive. 40, 50,000 downloads, just a couple of K here and there. That's great. And you're also pretty heavily involved in SQL Pass.
Yeah, I have been over the years. I spent a while on the Pass board. I just like the community worldwide. In fact, one of the things that I was probably most proud of when I first started with Pass, it was very just a North American organisation at the time, and I was very determined to try and change that. And so at the time I was involved in the chapter program, like the sort of user group type program, and they had, I think at the time they had about 70 or 80, and they were mostly North American. But I was pleased that by the time I left they had sort of over 200, and most of them were then outside the US. And so I spent a lot of time dealing with people in everywhere from Europe to South America to and so on. So
I've certainly noticed that change over the time I've been at Microsoft. I remember SQL Pass was, as you say, completely North American. Worldwide meant Canada and the US.
Like World Series.
Yeah, like World Series. But now, as you said, there are chapters all over the world, and and not only chapters, but also influential people in the past organisation.
Yeah.
Kudos to you and all those people who've done that. That's really good.
The other thing I love is that there have been some quite independent, really excellent other events have appeared as well. So, for example, one of my favourites there, which I never get to, but every time I sit there and just almost cry that I don't get there, is SQL Bits in the UK.
Right.
They seem to have worked out how to run slightly quirky, very entertaining conferences that get really popular. And the guys that are doing that in the UK are doing a fabulous job. One I've also got this year, which I'm looking forward to again, I'm heading to Wrocław in Poland for SQL Day in May. And so, and I think the current plan is we'll probably do a little bit of a user group tour down through areas of Europe while there in May.
That sounds fascinating. Doing stuff at conferences where English is not the first language is a really interesting thing to do as well.
Yes, indeed. One of the things Andrew would know is I've been spending the last couple of years trying to learn Mandarin, which is like a major challenge. And probably if I look forward and go, what would my ultimate goal be? It'd be to be able to deliver a session in Mandarin. I think that would be excellent. I have done some training for Microsoft in Beijing and so on, but always with someone in the room who always in English and with someone who speaks English. But yeah, I'd love to be able to do that. I spend a bit of time now on the SQL Server forums in Chinese, and very slowly and badly answer questions.
That's fantastic. I think one of the fascinating things for me is how involved you've been with the development of the SQL product, just in general, because you're for someone who's not a Microsoft employee, and I don't think ever has been a Microsoft employee, you've been very heavily involved with the product teams in both the conceptualization of new features, but also in things like the development of samples.
Yeah, look, fairly involved. I often think one of the things is I have a feeling if I actually ever joined the company, I think I'd be able to have less influence. And so
that's true.
This is a kind of an interesting thing where from surrounding the company, you can sort of have quite intense interest in particular areas, which I think it's harder for employees to actually get to do that. And so in the case of the product group, yeah, I've worked with them a lot over a lot of years. In fact, one of the things that was actually quite pleasing when they had a master's certification program, I used to go and teach a week or two of that each, and about 4 times a year. So one of the nice things with that is most of the premier field engineers and people like that, I typically know a lot of those people worldwide simply because they went through that program. And so that's actually been useful. I was involved in building back at the 2008 R2 and 2012 period the courseware that was used for official curriculum. And for 2016, yeah, we ended up building all the samples that were the new Wide World Importers samples. So
that's fascinating. So we've gone from pubs through Northwind and AdventureWorks, and now what is it? Wide World Importers.
Wide World Importers.
Wide World Importers.
Microsoft unfortunately has a very limited list of company names that they can use. Because obviously you can imagine if they try and use something else, they'd end up in all sorts of trouble, or if they picked something else, somebody might register it and so on. You know, there are difficulties. So we had to pick something. So yes, apologies, it is Wide World Importers, and I don't know how many times I've written it the other way myself. And as you joked earlier, IntelliSense probably try and fix it for you. But one of the things that I quite like with it is we had an opportunity to build something that was a little more typical, where one of the things they tried to do with AdventureWorks was to use every single part of the entire product.
Right.
And the downside of that is it actually made it probably one of the least typical databases on the planet, simply because it tried to use every feature of the product. And they decided instead of doing that, we'd try and build something a little more typical, still use a wide number of things within the product, but still try and keep it to something that was a lot more realistic.
So one of the sessions you're doing here at Ignite this week is what's new in SQL 2016 for developers.
Yes.
And so I guess you building those samples, you've got a lot of sort of war stories.
Yeah, in
about
fact,
what's going on
I'll
with
show a lot of things from that, because as part of building those samples, we did build demo code and things and examples and so on that are actually used by the different people from the team all over the place.
And have you got some good examples of things that you like?
I think some of the areas I sort of spend some time certainly having a look at. I think things around temporal tables and row-level security, and there's so many things in 2016.
Tell me about temporal tables, because I'm a GIS guy from way back and a modelling guy from way back, and we used to use what we called a temporal database, which is all about capturing data over time.
Yeah, things over time. Yeah, it's in fact when they did the spatial stuff years ago, you'll notice the prefix on all of that was spatiotemporal. It was actually ST underscore something, but they did the spatial but not the temporal at the time. Now what they've gone and done is gone and build a temporal form of tables. In the industry there are 3 types. There are systemporal, aptemporal and bitemporal, and so I can sort of explain to them the difference in all those. But what the team has built so far are systemporal tables, and so the idea is that if we have, for example, a customers table and that data changes over time, we get to capture all the changes as they occur.
Right.
And importantly, you get to then write a query that just says, look, go off and find me this customer as it looked at a particular point in time.
So that's fascinating, and there's a bunch of different places where that might be really interesting. One of the fascinating ones that I've found is in legislation.
Yes.
So you might have to, you want to, there's a lawsuit and someone's suing someone for a particular thing that happened at a particular point in time, or is being charged with something that happened at a particular point in time. But you need to know what the law said as at the 13th of January 1927,
Correct.
or whatever the number is, and you can do that with the...
and again, in terms of the related table, so what did each one of those things look like at that time?
Yeah, that's cool, and having that built into the system is very, very neat. So the other thing you're talking about is SQL in the cloud, SQL DB. Tell us a bit about that transition.
Yeah, look, one of the things I really want people to stop and think about is moving more to a declarative way of provisioning databases. So the traditional thing has been worry about files and I/O and performance, all those sort of lower level aspects, but it's been more about how do you do that, right? And I think where we need to move is to a point where people say, look, I want this size database, I want it there, I want it to perform this fast, I want another copy over there, I want a readable replica over there and so on, but it's a declarative thing, not an example where you sit there working out how to achieve that.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. And it seems to me that someone else taking care of all that busy work, there's something that's common across every implementation of that is something that you should, as a developer or as a DBA, shouldn't have to worry about. It's
No,
something
exactly.
that's really commoditised.
And look, many of the things are becoming more and more specialised, and the question is, do you really want to even know how that works,
Right.
And so, best example I often give is that years ago I was in a company and we wanted to share free busy calendars with Microsoft. So we tried to set up federation on Lync and various things and so on, and it was difficult getting that working. By comparison, our own company now is relatively small, and we moved to Office 365. I went into the admin, checked a box that said I wanted to do that, and it's worked ever since. And I haven't got a clue how that works,
And why should you care?
but I don't want to.
Yeah, exactly right. No, I think that's exactly what it is. What are you seeing as the trends? Where are people? You're obviously working with a number of different organisations at the moment, both big and small. What are the things that people are thinking about in terms of data, particularly relational data? Are they still thinking about relational data, or are they going
Look,
NoSQL?
very much so. There was it's quite funny. Every time I see something over the years that they keep talking about, this will end SQL or SQL will disappear. And yet the thing I find is that every new thing they do ends up with SQL on it. And so even a lot of the NoSQL movement ends up building a SQL layer over the top of it because they've just worked out that was the way to do it. If you look at even things like Stream Analytics, again, it's a SQL layer they've built over the top of that as the way to get to the data. DocumentDB, a JSON store, they've built a SQL layer over the top of that.
Well, there's a lot to be said for that whole structured query language thing, isn't there? It's been going like that for a long, long time, and it's obviously been proven it's worth. Now, very quick last question around frameworks and relational object relational mapping. How do you reckon that's going?
It's a challenge. In fact, one of the things I encourage people to do, I'm actually a fan of them doing code generation instead of directly using a lot of the object relational mappers. And simply because whenever you buy into those sort of frameworks, someone's making decisions for you that you might regret later, but then you can't change.
Right.
And so whereas if you do, it is more work to do some code generation, but anything you come across, you can just fix.
Yeah.
But I don't want people doing boilerplate code in bulk by themselves. I do want them to do metadata-driven code generation. So even, for example, if we look at the samples we built for SQL Server 2016, I hope when people look at that, they'll find it's really consistently done. And that's because, again, we started with metadata, built code generation, and built the whole thing off that.
Well, Greg, 15 minutes is never long enough to have a chat to you. I'm
Indeed.
sorry we're going to have to wrap it up, but I'm really looking forward to seeing your sessions during the week, and of course watching the other stuff you produce. If you want to see Greg's stuff, there's over 16 event sessions just from TechEd and Ignite. Check them out on Channel 9, and the couple will come up from today and tomorrow as well. Next up, we've got Michael Ridland in the main arena talking about what's new in Xamarin Forms, and that's a fascinating. We'll have Michael and Alec Tucker on the show a bit later on today. So until then, I'll see you next time.
Enjoy the show.